basics of cyanobacteria. We'll have short questions. We'll have about 5-10 minutes of questions after each presentation, and then we'll have a time for a discussion afterwards. If you have any needs during any of the presentations, you can chat those in, and Christine, who's will be taking care of helping us. If you have any help questions on Zoom or anything like that, she can help you out. And then Craig Cooper, who's the two dolphins there on his picture, he'll be putting questions together. If we have the same question, he'll bring those on. And we'll bring, if we get a lot of questions, we'll go through them in order that we receive them. If we just have a few, then we'll turn your mic off and we'll have you weigh in with your question at that time. So in the chat, just put a small amount of question that you may have. The second presentation, I'll go over what we did and what we saw last year for the harmful algae bloom response. The third presentation will be about HABs and the surface water quality and how they interact with each other. And the fourth presentation will be steps forward from Frank Wilhelm with University of Idaho. All of the presenters, can everybody hear me okay? Any problems with audio? Okay. The presenters will introduce themselves before each of the presentations. And again, please post in your questions using chat. We will not be using the hands up question process. We'll just be doing it through chat. And if you want to, you can right click on your own screen and change your name, or put a name if you want to have one up or something like that. But it just helps a little bit so you can know who's from where, who's from what place and what's going on there. So I guess if we don't have any questions with getting set up, our first presentation is kind of the basics of cyanobacteria, and Kristen will be giving that presentation.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Kristen Larson. I work with Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. I've been with the department for 12.5 years. In the Coeur d'Alene Regional Office, I do a lot of work in a lot of different watersheds. So pretty well versed in water quality in this region. I got my master's degree in 1991. It was in arsenic and water quality over on the Madison River in Montana. Ever since then, I've been in the field of water quality. So I worked for the University of Idaho, and then I worked for Montana State. So I've been in the field for a pretty long time. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get started with the presentation. Can you see that? Let me get the, hold on, I got to get this. Okay. All right, so the beginning slide, hold on, I haven't done a presentation yet. Okay, so just want to let everybody know kind of what we're talking about. If you look at the planet and the amount of water that's on the earth itself, only 2.5% of that water is fresh water, the rest of it is salt. And so really right off the bat, and then 2.475% of that fresh water is tied up in the glaciers and ice caps, so only 0.025% of water is usable to the humans. It is not a renewable resource, so what we've got is what we've got, and that's the importance of maintaining good water quality on the surface waters and in our freshwater systems. All right, so we most often hear we hear the term blue-green algae. That's what the news talks about when it comes up every summer here in this region. But really it's not blue-green algae, it's called cyanobacteria. It's actually a photosynthetic bacteria, which is really quite interesting, in that it can get energy from the sun. The cyanobacteria have a tendency when they have rapid excessive growth, it can turn into what we call a harmful algal bloom. And so you'll hear that term quite a bit. We interchange that with a HAB. That's the acronym for harmful algal bloom. So if you hear us say HAB, that's what we're talking about, is the harmful. It's when it has grown to an extent that it now has the potential to be harmful to the public. So where are they present? Toxic algae blooms have been reported in almost every state in the nation and in every type of water body: lakes, rivers, streams, rivers, coastal and estuary and marine systems. And why are they a concern? Well, most prevalent, like what we said, that HAB or a harmful algal bloom, they have the ability to produce toxins. So I'll talk about those toxins in just a minute. They can produce real unsightly scums that can build up on the shoreline, and then also along, if they're really bad, it can be on the surface of the entire water body or a big portion of the water body. We've seen that in several of the lakes here in North Idaho. So that in turn, the toxicity in those unsightly scums affect recreation, they affect aesthetic, and then a side product of these blooms is they consume a lot of oxygen, so we can have what's called hypoxia, which is a low oxygen condition. The picture there of the dead cow reminds me that we did have in the 1980s on Black Lake, there was a bad enough harmful algal bloom that some cattle next to the lake, they drank from the lake, or they drank from water that was on the shoreline, in the shoreline of the lake, and there was some cattle deaths. So that's the first recorded deaths of harmful algae blooms in, as a result of harmful algae blooms in North Idaho. So they're kind of a neat critter, even though they can produce toxins and be quite harmful. They have advantages, ecological advantages, that give them over just the regular algae in the water column. And the first one is nitrogen fixation. So most algae in water, or algae in water, need both nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients, but those are the big nutrients. And these little guys, the cyanobacteria, can float up to the surface of the water and fix nitrogen out of the air. So that's how they get their nitrogen. So when that particular nutrient is, as the summer goes along, used up by the green algae, then these cyanobacteria can come and dominate, because they can get their nitrogen from the air. They can regulate their buoyancy. So this animation, or this cartoon on the right, is kind of showing different times of the day. They can be in different parts of the water column, and so they can float up to the surface and get their nitrogen or nutrients, and then they can go back down. So it's pretty interesting. They have the ability to grow rapidly. So a harmful algae bloom can happen within an amount of hours. And then they can store nutrient, and then, like we already said, toxicity. Conditions that are favorable for cyanobacterial blooms, or the blue-green algae blooms, is, and not in order of importance, is water temperature. So they favor warmer water temperatures, 60 to 80 degrees, but they can also survive in much warmer temperatures. Once the air temperatures get about 85, 90 degrees here in North Idaho, that's when we start getting calls and start seeing these blooms start taking effect. Nutrients are another important condition that is necessary for their growth, and we'll talk quite a bit about that in just a little bit. And then no flow or quiescent conditions favor cyanobacteria. And one of the things this picture on the right is reminding me that, so in North Idaho, we've seen harmful algae blooms in many of the lakes: Fernand Lake, Hayden Lake, Hauser Lake, although we haven't gotten complaints in a while. Avondale Lake, Coquilala, Black Lake, those are all ones that we can commonly get calls on, and then go and respond and see that there are harmful blooms in progress. One of a common feature that we're seeing in some of the more chronically blooming lakes are these inundated wetlands that are underwater for longer parts of the year, not naturally. It's because of holding lake level higher. And that's just one commonality that we're seeing. All right, so the toxins, there's 4 different types of toxins that these guys could produce. Some of them can produce several of them, or some of them may only produce one type. The first type of toxin is the hepatotoxin, which is a liver toxin. So it disrupts the proteins that keep the liver functioning. One of the toxins that you'll hear quite a bit about today is the microcystin toxin. It's one that we can go out and sample for and measure and get a concentration for. It's expensive to do, so we don't do it all the time, but that is one that we do. The next toxin is a neurotoxin. This is a very concerning toxin. It can cause rapid paralysis of skeletal and respiratory muscles within minutes. One of the stories that hit the news in 2013, there was a herd of elk that came across a water source that had, I think it was, well, it had the antitoxin A being produced, and those elk took a drink and didn't get very far from that particular water source. They all died very quickly. They can also produce skin toxins or dermatotoxins that cause rashes. And then recent research has linked the BMAA toxin to some organisms that can cause neurological problems. This particular slide that I took from Dr. Barry Rosen, who is a leading phycologist, which is a guy that studies algae. It says ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, but they're also seeing that there might be links to Alzheimer's and dementia. So when do we classify a HAB in this region? Okay, so what we do is we are complaint driven, DEQ. So if somebody sees a surface scum, we'll get a call and we'll go out and take a sample. And we have the ability to come back very quickly and look under the microscope to see if those particular organisms, the cyanobacteria organisms, are present. We also kind of have an idea what the concentration is, but we cannot enumerate it. So we send those, if we think that there may be excessive growth of these particular organisms, they are natural in the water system, but, or in surface water. But when they begin to accumulate quite a bit and we suspect there may be a harmful algal bloom, we'll send it to the professional lab for enumeration. And for the microcystis cell, our threshold is 20,000 cells, and then all other species is 40,000. And we don't typically do microcystin testing right off the bat, but the suggested EPA advisory for microcystin was 4 micrograms per liter. Now it's 8, but our response plan is still 4, so we'll go with that number today. So we work really closely with Panhandle Health District. If those thresholds are met or exceeded, we will contact the Panhandle Health, and they will be the one to issue the health advisory. This is a sign that gets put up near the water body if we recommend a harmful algal bloom. We also work with lake associations to help get the word out. At Twin Lakes last year, we had a lot of help. Chris Volz was really good at getting the word out, and the Lake Association, the Twin Lakes Improvement Association. And we really appreciate the help in getting the word out. All right, so like I said, many of the lakes in our region have experienced harmful algal blooms, but I'm going to highlight Fernan Lake because it is in a chronic blooming condition. We've been documenting ourselves. We really got our response to these blooms started in 2009, but in 2012 is when we really started doing the health advisories. So as you can see from this table, in 2012 we had 10 health advisory days, but those numbers have gone up, and from 2016 to 2019, not including 2017, the advisory days have been over 100 days. So the blooms typically hit in late June. So about this time, we're a little cooler this year, and they can go clear to ice out. So we have measured microcystin pretty regularly in that lake just because the advisories go for so long, and the highest microcystin concentration that we measured was 95.6. Now remember that the health advisory the advisory for recreation, the EPA advisory is 8 micrograms per liter, and our response plan is 4, so it was significantly higher. So this is a picture of Fernand Lake in 2015. It's pea green, and there's not a boat in sight. And this is pretty typical of what happens on Fernand Lake. The recreation use is pretty much gone on that lake. So we really value that use, the recreation use of our North Idaho lakes, and so it's quite sad that Fernand doesn't experience that. This is what it looks like. You see the fishermen and no recreation. All right, so the next slides are really just kind of some pictures to show you, and I'm sorry for those of you who are on the phone. It's just a few slides of what these blooms can look like. They're all pictures taken from our North Idaho lakes, different blooms. And then I've got a picture of what they look like under the microscope because they're really quite beautiful organisms, and it's really fun to come back. This organism is Dolichospermum, and it used to be called Anabina. It is a pretty nasty player. Oh, and the pictures that I'm showing are all organisms that we saw in Twin Lakes last year. So Dolichospermum can produce both microcystin and the antitoxin toxin. So it is quite beautiful, and it can present itself in this iridescent green, but it doesn't always. But it's very, very concerning and toxic. Pleotrichia looks like a Horton. Here's a poo ball under the microscope. It's really quite fascinating and fun to look at, but it's also not as very unsightly once it forms scums. And this is a picture of Fernand Lake in that inundated wetland with a bloom happening right there. Microcystis and Warrenchinea. Microcystis, it looks like that paint splotch, and Warrenchinea looks like a little cockleburr, I guess. And those two were also seen were players in the Twin Lake bloom last year. And this picture is a picture of a bloom that was happening on Fernand Lake. All right, so this is an actual picture of a scum that we saw in Upper Twin Lake. And then under the microscope, we often see a cocktail of organisms. Not often do we just see one. So we can see Microcystis and Warrenchinea and Dolichospermum in this underneath the microscope. And then specific to this bloom, we also saw a pretty good green algae. I can't remember what it's called. Bob, you'll have to say. What's it called?
Dinobrium.
Dinobrium, thank you. All right, so at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Bob just to go through a chronology of what happened last year, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
All right, I believe I'm sharing my screen now. Again, I'm Bob Steed with the Coeur d'Alene Regional Office. I was a surface water ecologist while we were doing this study. So the Coeur d'Alene region has experienced blue-green algae blooms since about 2007. Prior to that, there are historic records of blooms occurring in Hayden Lake and a couple others, real problems. But for kind of our tenure, it really wasn't an issue for us at that time. And our first bloom was on Fernand Lake. We keep bringing that up. But in 2007, we didn't know what we were doing with Fernand Lake. We got a complaint that we had these big blooms on it. And we have slowly over the years learned how to deal with what's happening with each of those blooms. Well, Twin Lakes was kind of that way for us last year. Krista and I work on different projects, but we do take on the harmful algae blooms within this region. And it was our first time called out to Twin Lakes. What we were expecting to see are these scums that are typical of these blooms. And of the 4 slides that I'm showing you there, they're pretty easy to distinguish from. and they're rapidly a concern. And you can see, well, when you have such a concentration of cells, the likelihood of having toxins present increases when you have more cells, like in those pictures. So on July 26th of last year, we received a complaint from a member of the community. The complaint was really that the previous couple days she had observed scums and unusual layers on the water in the vicinity of on the northwest side of Twin Lake. That's typically our kickoff for we need to go out and take a look at the area. We did follow up, and if you can see the purple zone that I've identified on my slide, we walked that shoreline looking for what we would find as a typical harmful algae bloom. And we did not see any on that date. We took a sample there. We also went to the boat ramp, the fishing game boat ramp that's within the channel, and there was a very classic scum layer that we took a sample of on that July 26th date. And we realized this is kind of a new area for us. I mean, we've had, my predecessor, Tom, had worked a lot with the group up there and everything, but we weren't sure where the egress points were, you know, where the boat ramps were and all that kind of stuff at the time. And we may have added to the confusion by calling some of the boat ramps the wrong thing on our initial survey. That sample, what I'm going to show you here, that sample, this is a map that shows the channel, and the DEQ AB 394, I'll just refer to these by the last three numbers. That's a sample that we took, and here are the results. On 394, we had 165,000 microcystis cells, 305 dolichospermum, 20,000 gliotrichia, and 3.8 million Wernickeria. These are all potential toxin-producing cyanobacteria, and they well exceed our 20,000 or 40,000 cell count. That gives us worry that there's a potential that toxins have been produced. On my chart here, you'll see the blue line through the 393. That was for a different lake. That wasn't for Twin Lakes. Now I want to talk a little bit about the criteria that we use. We base our concern on two things. One is the cell count and one is the toxin produced. Cell count information is readily available. It does cost about $120 a sample to get a cell count done. We don't do those in-house, but we can give you an idea pretty quickly whether or not this is going to be a high count or a low count. And that saves the state money by us previewing these things under the microscope before just sending them directly to the lab. The other thing that happens is we're getting all kinds of criteria from different sources out there on what's safe, what isn't safe. On the top right, the drinking water of constant use of water is really at 0.3 parts per billion. Just for the record, parts per billion, if we use that number, or micrograms per liter, they're interchangeable, those units. So keep in mind, we're thinking along the lines of if this water is used for drinking, values less than 1 or around 1 are a concern. For recreational use, where ingestion is less likely than pure drinking water, a standard of 4 parts per billion is what we have in our state plan. Since then, EPA's come out and said, well, we think that 8 parts per billion is safe. As you know, Kristen, the state of Idaho just responds to these. We're not doing academia or research on all this kind of stuff. We're thrown with a bunch of numbers that say, hey, these are concentrations that will be dangerous for your public. And we don't really have one clear number to go with on that. We followed up on the 30th because we saw these results are staggering on the quantity of the Wernickeria and the dolichospermum. Those are especially the dolichospermum is one that we are concerned with, that genus. So we did a follow-up immediately after that on the 30th. and keep in mind, we just spanned the weekend. So we're now on, I think, on Monday or Tuesday of the next week. It's after we got our results back. We did a shoreline survey of the entire lower Twin Lake. So we drove the boat around very slowly, looked at every single section of it, looking for those blooms that I showed you on that first picture, these big green patches. They'd be hard to miss. We also contacted Panhandle Health District and said, hey, we have high enough concentrations that we need to talk with you about issuing a health advisory. So the health advisory is, again, between DEQ and Panhandle Health District, and we have a conversation and come to an agreement of whether or not that's appropriate in a given situation. The health district is much better prepared at human health type issues, and certainly how much risk we're willing to take. And DEQ brings to the table the ecologic understanding of what's going out in the environment. So we go out and do the field work and everything, and then share with Panhandle Health District. On the 30th, we took samples as well. What we observed there is we didn't observe any scum on the lower lake. We expected to find some because that's how we've seen most of our lakes behave. The 667 sample was taken again at the boat ramp, and the numbers had greatly decreased since 3 days prior to that. So you can see we're in a chinny at 66,000 and Dolichospermum at 1,600. And I think why that's important is you'll see it go back up and down throughout our advisory and everything. We also took a sample at 666, which is kind of the area that we'd expect the wind direction to blow, an accumulation of this. When they go to the surface, they can be pushed by the wind into a bay. That was kind of we didn't see one there, but we went ahead and sampled. And again, we were pretty low, even though Dolichospermum was present, it wasn't at a concern level for us. But one thing we did notice is the entire lower lake had a bloom going on, but it was dispersed bloom like I'm showing you in this picture. So we don't have a surface scum of a bunch of bright stuff, but we've got all of these small colonies forming and leaving little specks in the water. So that still is a harmful algae bloom, but it's not at those concentrations because there's so much water with it, it's mixed throughout the water column. This is the Dolichospermums. Each of these, when we talk about cells, each of these individual spheres is a cell. There's different kinds of cells associated with them, but they congregate into colonies, and these long rods are colonies, and then the long rods wrap around each other, and this becomes a bigger colony. And that's what we were observing in the water at the boat ramp and other places in the lower lake, kind of uniformly distributed through the lake. So this diagram, I'm trying to show you what again, this is an important concept because we were worried that we were always at the it could happen any moment phase with the lower lake. So the cells and the colonies are distributed throughout the water column, and we can only see a few of them. If we took a sample of it, we were getting low concentrations because they weren't congregated up along the air surface. Typically, the blooms that we see in the past in other lakes are distributed. These colonies come up to the surface, again, to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, to create a little microcosm of the nutrients that they need to propagate rapidly. And we see rapid growth when they're in the air. And then the third thing that can happen with a harmful algae bloom is the wind stacks all of this air, all of the stuff that's risen to the surface over along a shoreline. And it's typically at boat ramps and other areas, but it's where the recreationalists will be involved with this type of stuff. And this is the situation that we were worried that was going to occur on Twin Lakes, because we certainly had all of the colonies available. They just weren't congregating the way they typically do. I'm going to borrow again from Dr. Rosen. This is a slide that he gave at a presentation, but it says, you know, this is your initial distribution. You've got about 100,000 cells per liter. your toxins would be at 20 micrograms. It depends on the species present and whether or not they're producing toxins. But that same amount, if you let them buoy up and float at the surface, you can get up to 10 million cells per liter, and you're 1,000 times more concentrated in cells, and it would do the same as the toxins. And then once it's wind blown against the shoreline or something like that, you can see how your numbers greatly increase from that phenomenon. So on the 30th, again, back out in the field, this is the lower boat ramp. There was a posting put up by the county, and they basically took our press release and laminated it and put it up on the signs and everything. So we had information out there. Again, this is early on our investigation. It was concentrated in that picture that I showed you of the bloom. I'm going to go back. This one right here was taken just down the dock from these people that are recreating. So our third, I'm not going to do all of our follow-ups, but the third time we went out, we did visit we had a scum on the upper Twin Lake. It was mostly in the little purple sphere or polygon on the map kind of shows you what location we're in. And this was a lot of dust, bug parts, pollen, other things like that. But it also had entrained some Cyanobacteria species as well. This is August 9th. So you can see that little area there that we were in, and 675. We did have a microcystin present in that bloom that we thought was nothing but dust and bug parts. So you're starting to see that we're getting some accumulations of this. Sample 676 was taken again at the boat. No, this is the channel outside the boat ramp. And we had much more than 5 parts per billion in that sample. Now, in order for us to save money, we're asking the lab to give us values. And with this lab, we asked, once we're above 5, you don't need to do more dilutions because it ends up costing us more money. So just report that we have a lot more than 5 at this point. So you'll see some of those that are just the double greater than 5 just indicates that we have 5 or greater on that sample. 678 was taken down by the boat ramp in the lower lake. Again, it's not at our criteria level, but it is a concern, and this is just a raw sample being taken there. And 679 was taken in the middle of lower, in one of the deep spots of lower Twin Lake, and you can see we're at 0.37. So we didn't have, on this sample, we didn't order identification and enumeration. Again, each of these samples is costing 120, 150 bucks, and our budget goes up pretty quick as we order these samples. So on this one, I think that the purpose of the sampling was just to make sure that the species that were present were producing toxins. And then this is the picture of the boat ramp again at the Fish and Game boat ramp in the channel portion. And you can see this scum here is a real concern for us because it's right at an access point, and we have a lot of people utilizing that area. I guess one of our concerns too, even though it's not in our rules and everything, but typically when people put boats in the water and they've got pets along, the dog runs down and gets right in this stuff first thing. And in Idaho, we do get dog deaths from Cyanobacteria blooms, and it's pretty sad, and that is probably our most sensitive population, our dogs, because they do lap it up. It smells kind of funky. They like that kind of stuff, and they get into this pretty readily. So just when people are untying their boats, if they keep an eye on their pets, just try to stay away from these type of scums. This is a slide looking at that same bloom right there. And one thing you notice here is these I don't know how do you describe these, the peppered looking cells in here, these are microcystis, and that does worry us because microcystis is the predominant toxin producer in North Idaho. That's the one that creates the microcystin for the most part that we see. And when it shows up on the stage or we start seeing microcystin, we get more concerned that there's likely, higher likelihood of toxin present. And then this is a couple pictures of the cockleburrs or the Wernichinia that Kristen was talking about. They're also present in this. You can also see these long strands are just green algae. So there's a real mix of stuff that we're looking at when we're looking under the microscope at these. On our fourth follow-up, we're still expecting the dispersed bloom in the lower lake to come up to the surface and run over to a shore. It just hasn't done it. But remember that slide Kristen had up early that showed the cartoon of the cyanobacteria going up and down in the water column? That can happen within hours. It can go from being distributed through the water column up in the all sitting on the surface within a couple hours, and we see them change rapidly. Matter of fact, we've been in the boat and seen them form right out underneath us. They can go from nothing to something really rapidly. So one thing that we did on this follow-up 4 is take a tow sample out in the middle of the lake to see what concentrations we would get if they did raise to the surface and blow along a shoreline. And the tow sample is a way of us concentrating the sample to predict what it would be under those circumstances. This is back to that. I've got a date wrong here. I'm not quite sure what it is, but 687, again, that is at the Fish and Game boat ramp in the channel. We're much more than 5 parts per billion. And 686, which is out here in the middle of Lower Twin Lake, where we did the plankton tow, was also much greater than 5 parts per billion. This is our 6th visit. This is August 28th. These ducks are swimming through the bloom at the Idaho Fish and Game boat ramp. And on that date, on August 28th, we're starting to see that phenomenon of they're stringers or I don't exactly know what to call them, but we're starting to see it accumulate on the surface in near the channel in the upper Twin Lake. The results from the August 28th sampling, 606 is at the Fish and Game boat ramp. We are still seeing quantities that exceed our 20,000 cells per milliliter. We're also seeing the presence of microcystin. Keep in mind, microcystin can also change throughout the day on what the concentration is. At 607, which is the upper Priest Lake boat ramp, we measured, at 11 o'clock in the morning, we took a sample. There was certainly scum starting to form in that area, and we measured 1.3 million parts per billion, and toxin was being produced at that point. That was an interesting one because I was kind of reaching over the dock to take a sample of a scum that was forming in there, and a child came up, swam up to right through my scum and onto the dock and climbed up the ladder onto the dock where I was taking the sample. 609 is a sample taken within the channel. We noticed that you've got a big addition of the Gliotrichia. Again, that's the Horton here's a who puff type concentration, over 10.4 million parts per billion. Gliotrichia is the one that we're having huge problems with on Fernan Lake because once it's established, it seems to come back year after year after year. And it really is driven by temperature is when that one shows up. So in Fernan Lake, we've had a cool June, but if it was warm all June, we would have a Gliotrichia bloom right now. I'm really sure in Fernan Lake. Yeah.
You said 609 was in the channel, but it was not. It was on the shoreline of Upper Twin.
Oh, I'm mistaken. I look at the wrong. You're right.
Yeah.
That's my next slide. Sorry. 609. That's correct. It's at the. You can see this purple area. My next slide will show that a little better. Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. So we observed on that date a blooms accumulating in this entire area that I've identified in the purple, and then a very aggressive bloom in the area that has a white line around it, which is a picture on the bottom right here that shows what that bloom looked like in that area. And I'll go back to the concentrations in that. Again, that 609 had 3.9 anabine, or I'm sorry, dolichospermum, 270,000 Wernickeia, and 10.4 million of gliotrichia. When we came back from our survey that day, the upper boat ramp had a lot of recreational pressure, and the bloom had pretty much disappeared in that area. And what I mean by disappeared is it had clinged to the surfaces of the humans that have been swimming in there, and it adhered to their bodies. They got out of the water, and they essentially cleaned up the area just because they were using it hardly. This included toddlers and all kinds of kids up in this area. And that's a real concern for us, is people just need to be informed. We're not trying to say they shouldn't use an area, but they need to be informed that there's a potential for having toxins present. So we had several other visits on the lake, but I kind of want to, that kind of gets boring, but I wanted to go over our health advisories. We issued with Panhandle Health District a health advisory on July 29th that was the lower lake only. On August 20th, we extended that to Upper Twin Lake, and September 20th is when we lifted the advisory for both lakes. We had various postings around the lake, and this is something that would help from the community. What's effective, what works. Again, it was great of the county to provide our press release on that. You can see this orange sign that Kristen had in her previous slides, kind of gives you an overall view of what our typical postings look like. And they were throughout the lake. The posting is the responsibility of Panhandle Health District, but we assist in doing that kind of thing. And we could certainly use more information if you have comments or concerns on what's effective posting. Twin Lakes, again, since it was our new one, we had a lot of community concern that hadn't been there. We'd heard a lot of people saying this is how it always is, you know, but we didn't know that because we hadn't responded to previous blooms. We got over 88 calls from the public regarding Twin Lakes and HABs. We tried to take a lot of those as we were doing our field monitoring, and thanks for Christine to getting all those, make sure that we got back to everybody. And that was from a period of July 29th all the way to November 14th. We had a lot of questions about it. This column on the right really shows you we're also working on all of these other lakes at the same time, trying to help people with other cyanobacteria issues. And then we also have a website that got a lot of use through this period that described the situation. That's where people could go for information. And that's still up and available. As we have advisories, we post on there, and there's places for additional information. So again, I guess, you know, on the July, I'll take a couple questions on that before we move on. But we're really looking at a lot of different organisms that live in the water and we saw really high concentrations in both lakes. Craig, do you have any questions related to my?
Yeah, Bob, thanks. We got a lot of questions. They kind of group into two kinds. One is what's happening at Twin Lakes, and one is some of the science. So I'm going to start off with kind of the questions about what's happening at Twin Lakes. The first one combines a couple, is where do they occur in 2019, upper or lower or both? And was 2019 the first time there were HABs on Twin Lakes?
So yes, they occurred in both. If you look at the length of the summer, both upper and lower Twin Lake. What we're really worried about, again, is a scum that forms along a shoreline where people are recreating in it or dogs are using it for play. Yeah, they were in both lakes. I don't know the answer. I've never been to Twin Lakes for a harmful algae bloom except for last year. We've been to Twin Lakes for some other water quality monitoring. And again, you know, Kristen and I at the time were kind of the trained up the most in the office, and that's why we responded to most of the complaints. If you ask me how to handle one on Fernan, we've done it for 12 years. We know how to do that one really well because we know what to see on it and what places to go. But Twin Lakes was new to us. Talking to some of the public, I believe that we've had these distributed blooms in Lower Twin Lake in the past, but we haven't measured them. And I believe that we've seen scums in the Upper Lake in the past as well, but I have not observed them.
Okay. Another question, this comes from Chris, is there more harm for boats to go through the channel when the measurements are as we posted and helping spread it?
Boy, I don't have any real any opinion on that. I mean, I don't think that, yeah, boat traffic certainly mixes them up. It mixes up the nutrients that they're needing and everything. But I don't see boat traffic as being a real big distributor compared to wind and temperature. Really do a lot more of that than boat traffic.
Okay. One final question on kind of logistics of this is, are there projections for what the summer might be like?
Yeah, I'm just going to armchair this one and tell you that we see less blooms on a La Nina year. So that's when we get cooler Junes and kind of a shorter summer period. So I don't expect this year to be as bad as last year because of the temperatures that we've had through June. Another thing that really disrupts the growth of cyanobacteria is rain, and we've had a lot of rain in June too. So I'm just basing on what we've observed in the past. I expect us to have a lower year. Our worst year on record was 2015, and that was a real hot June with a lot of hot summer days with not much cloud cover, and that's the worst that we saw. So I'm hopeful that it's an easier season this year.
All right. We've got some questions on how to prevent them. I'm going to give you some science ones first. And they're kind of all over. There's a lot of them kind of hard to put into a group. I think one of the first ones is there a maximum lake depth beyond which there's no chance of harmful algae blooms?
Well, again, Kristen said that they can use the sun to create energy. So they're going to be on the surface water. They're not going to really typically be deep. But they do have a life history where they do die, and when they die, they consume oxygen. And Kristen will go over that a little bit in her next presentation.
Okay. I guess we got one set from Cheryl, had a lot of different questions. So do you want me to summarize those or have Cheryl ask them?
Why don't we have Cheryl ask them?
Okay, Cheryl, go for it. She's still there?
Christine, do you need to unmute her?
I don't see where I could mute her or
Oh,
unmute her.
She doesn't have a mic on, so I guess I'll ask them for her.
Okay, sounds good.
The first one is, if I understand it, is do blue-green algae have to go up there because nutrients are too high and the lake becomes anoxic? And then how does airflow go from the lower water to the upper water or vice versa?
Okay, I don't understand the airflow question, but so what's really going on is when we have excess phosphorus in our system, the balance is out of whack where we have more phosphorus than nitrogen, and cyanobacteria have an advantage in that situation over green algae. When the nitrogen and phosphorus is balanced, green algae is the predominant species. But when you have excess phosphorus, then again, remember, these cyanobacteria can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that's when they go to the surface to do that fixation.
Okay. A clarification on the airflow question. It says airflow contributes to growth in other areas. So I'm guessing maybe how airflow across the lake impacts blue-green algae growth.
Yeah, it's really quiescent conditions are suitable for cyanobacteria. So when you have calm days and not a lot of wind, you're going to have more cyanobacteria surviving than when you have a windy day. And I guess that was the point I was trying to make, is when we get these a lot of consecutive days of quiescent conditions where you're not getting any wind. Every time I was on Twin Lake, there was a lot of wind in there last year, and that might be why the bloom never came to the surface. But that's really what I'm talking about, is quiet days, they grow better than on windy days.
Okay. I'm kind of combining some from multiple questioners on this. Is what contributes to higher blooms? What can cabin owners like users do to reduce the potential? And what do we do about to decrease the presence, if I'm understanding the questions correctly?
Okay. Can you hold those questions for after the next two presentations? Because we'll talk about some of those things.
Yes, I can certainly do that. There was one other question that's in here, is that you said when we found on Fernan, we know what to do, but didn't know what to do on Twin. Please explain.
Oh, sure. As far as a response goes, I know what to do. I don't know how to correct the problem, but I know which parts of the lake have the big bloom, where it's going to occur first, where to take my samples, and pretty much we know what organisms will be present in that bloom. Twin Lakes, we didn't even know how to get the boat in the water when we started, what ramps worked and how to get to the lower lake. And I ended up, I'm sure you've all experienced that, but that lower lake boat ramp is a long ways of backing up a boat to get down to the water side. You've got to turn around the boat all the way at the golf course to get down. So, we had a lot to learn on Twin Lakes that we didn't already know on some of the previous responses. And not having all the access points. Fernan Lake is easy to get to. Hayden Lake, the place that we get the bloom, is Fish and Game property, but we've got a lot of private land ownership on Twin Lakes and had to use boat access to really do a thorough survey.
Okay, thanks. We had one last question. I think this goes to the next one perhaps, is if airflow contributes to growth in other areas, what can we do to prevent it specifically of what we can control and not end up with a Fernan situation?
Yeah, let's push that off till later, but make sure you bring it back up again, okay, after we've gone through the other presentations.
Okay. I think we're about out of time for this section. If anyone has a question that I didn't address, please click the raise hand. They're kind of coming in fast and furious.
Okay. Let's go ahead and go to the next presentation now. Kristen has some more information on some limnology work that we did while we're investigating this bloom.
Okay. All right, so the cyanobacteria bloom is just one aspect of what we learned about Twin Lakes. And the rest of this, well, this part of my talk will be based on data that has been collected prior to the 1990s by Falter, and then some data that's been collected by the Twin Lakes Improvement Association. They have a volunteer monitoring program. That data set is not nearly as extensive as the study that was done before the 1990s. So I'm going to talk a little bit about lake functions. The first one, oh, let me get myself into presentation mode. Hold on. A second. All right, so one of the functions that we can see on some of the deeper lakes, and this is certainly what we see on lower Twin Lake in the summer, is you get this stratification due to temperature. So this is kind of a cross section of a lake, and then the watershed that's up above it, that's this cartoon. And on the deeper parts of the lake is the coldest water, and then as you go up the water column, the water is warmer. And so the colder temperature is actually heavier. And so we get these three regions of the lake cross section, or the lake water column, based on temperature. And the coldest water on the bottom, we call that the hypolimnion. And then the middle is the thermocline, and then the top is that's exposed to the air temperature is the epilimnion. And this can happen, this can set clear through the summer or not. It depends on how deep the lake is, and then wind and wave action. Like in Fernan Lake, it can start doing this, and then wind and waves can disrupt this and mix the water, so the denser water gets mixed in, and then the temperatures kind of integrate. In Lower Twin Lake, this is a pretty common phenomenon that can last through the summer. It does not happen in the upper lake. It's a lot shallower, so wind and wave action disallow this particular phenomenon. So another kind of lake function, I guess you can call it, it's maybe not the best term for it, is called eutrophication. And it's actually a natural process for lakes. And what happens is you get this nutrient input, the nitrogen and the phosphorus, primarily from the watershed, the upper watershed, that go, or the lake shore, that is introduced into the lake itself. And they feed the algae and plants, so you get that algae and plant growth. And then as that algae or plants die, then they're decomposed by bacteria, and those bacteria need oxygen for this decomposition process. And so as the algae and plants are decomposed, oxygen is consumed. So if you have that stratification, where you have that epilimnion and the thermocline and the hypolimnion, and you don't have the wave and wind action to reintroduce oxygen into the water column, then you get a oxygen depletion. And most often it's the worst at the very bottom, or the hypolimnion of the lake. And so that's represented by that red region at the bottom, or the hypolimnion. So like I said, eutrophication is a natural process, but if we're introducing more nutrients from the watershed into the lake, then we would have even more algae growth, and then more decomposition and more oxygen consumption. And so then you're exacerbating this eutrophication process by introducing more nutrients from the watershed. So what are sources of nutrients? I'm going to talk about internal cycling in the next slide, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But fertilizer, so fertilizing lawns, nitrogen, phosphorus in fertilizer can certainly contribute. We suggest that the low phosphorus or no phosphorus fertilizers would be best for lakeshore owners. Soils really don't need phosphorus, they're already enough. Poorly maintained septic tanks, stormwater runoff can be a very big contributor of nutrients to lakes. Detergents, poor construction management, pet, wildlife and livestock waste, poor land stewardship, and erosion. Even boat wakes can erode the shoreline of lakes and rivers, and phosphorus in normal or a natural lake system or surface water system is tied pretty tightly to soil. So many of these nutrient processes are, the phosphorus is delivered with the soil, like through erosion processes. And so boat wakes, for example, when they undermine or they hit the shoreline that isn't protected by vegetation, can dislodge soil, and that phosphorus will end up in the lake. All right, so I'm going to talk about internal cycling now, and this is where that phosphorus, that sediment-bound phosphorus, can really become a big player in the lake condition. So you've got nutrients coming in from the watershed, and they are delivered into the water body and or into the lake, and we have the algae that's decomposing, and then in this particular cartoon, we've got the low oxygen situation at the bottom of the lake. Well, in the low oxygen situation, that phosphorus that was bound to sediment is released into the water column, so it becomes soluble. So under those low oxygen or anoxic conditions, you get a release of phosphorus that's into the water column. And in this particular situation, it's in that hypolimnion, which is that the lowest section of where the coldest water is. So if we get wind and wave action, or in the fall when the temperatures decrease and you no longer have that temperature gradient in the lake, you can get a fall turnover, or even just wind and wave action can turn the water, and so you get that introduction of phosphorus that was released in that anoxic condition that goes clear into the water column, and now it's available to algae that can consume it. So internal cycling is a really, really important condition that, if it's exacerbated, can really wreak havoc in a lake system, where you're introducing nutrients, you're introducing that phosphorus-bound sediment, that's onto sediment through erosive practices or erosive and other conditions. And then, so if you keep having that source of phosphorus coming in and that anoxic condition at the bottom of the lake, you're exacerbating the amount of phosphorus that can then be released in those low oxygen conditions at the bottom of the lake. So it's really concerning for Lower Twin Lake, and this isn't the Upper Twin because it doesn't stratify, is that low oxygen condition is clear up into the thermocline, almost to the epilimnion. And this was observed back in before the 1990s by Falter as well. He says in his reports that low oxygen goes clear up into the water column. And so now we've got a very thick layer of low oxygen and a lot of phosphorus that can be released. And again, this is specific to the Lower Twin Lakes. This is what we saw last year. We went out with our boat and our oxygen sensor, and we took some phosphorus samples, and this is what we saw, and this is what was seen earlier. So it's been happening in Lower Twin Lakes for a long time. And so what's been observed for phosphorus concentrations in the epilimnion, that top layer, has been 5 to 35 micrograms per liter. I don't have 2019 data, but in 2018 it was 13. And then if you go into the hypolimnion, up to 400 micrograms per liter or parts per billion were observed. In 2018 it was at 92 micrograms per liter. In 2017, 220. So we have significantly higher concentrations observed of phosphorus in the lower water column. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of agitation to get, if it's going clear into the thermocline, to add that phosphorus into the epilimnion to then feed the algae and the blue-green algae. And so that's quite concerning. For those of you that like graphs, this is a graph. On the y-axis on the left is sample depth. And the green triangles is oxygen. And the blue is the blue circles is temperature. So we've got pretty much 0 oxygen up to 7 meters in the water column. And we don't see that in other lakes of North Idaho. This is pretty concerning to have that thick of a low oxygen level in the lake. So I'm just going to touch on this. We were hoping that Department of Agriculture would be able to be on this call, and she was tied up. So she provided this slide for me. But Department of Agriculture is in charge of the aquatic noxious weeds. So this is another important part of the ecological system of the two lakes. And these, so she's given us some where they've done surveys for noxious weeds, and the ones they're really looking for is that they see in a lot of the other lakes in North Idaho is curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil. Starting to hear a lot more about those particular plants. They're very aggressive and can outcompete the natural vegetation of lakes. So much so that the state of Idaho has a boat inspection program where they have boat inspection stations at key places in all of Idaho to try to intercept boats that are bringing these very aggressive and very problematic plants into the lakes. So in 2017, 2018, and 2019, they did a pretty good, especially in 2019, a survey of the entire shoreline of both lower and upper lake, and then also the channel, and there was no presence of Eurasian water milfoil or curly-leaf pondweed. So this is a very good thing for the Twin Lakes. We do not have, so far we don't have the presence of those particular plants. But we are intercepting them according to Kim Holzer with the Idaho Department of Agriculture. We are intercepting boats on a daily basis that have these particular plants. So that in itself is concerning. We don't want to bring these plants into the lake, and it's a very good thing that we do not have those. So in summary, I've got this yellow light, traffic light up, meaning that we've got some concerns with the lakes. We saw a pretty significant harmful algal bloom in the upper lake last year. We saw the presence of the organisms, and there was toxins throughout both the upper and the lower lakes. Lakes are complex systems with no simple cause, so there's still a lot of unknowns. But we do know that from what we know about lake science is that cumulative impacts, meaning what we do around the lake and to the lake, it's like death. We call it death by 1,000 cuts. If you continue to cut and cut and cut and cut, eventually you're going to have a pretty significant bleed. And so we're wanting to put the warning out there that to be very conscientious that there are very concerning conditions that we observed last year, and that low oxygen condition has been going on for a while, which means that the internal cycling it probably has and will become even a bigger player in a more concerning situation. So we'd like lake managers and landowners around the lake to really take caution. And that's all I've got. Do we want to just go right into Frank?
I think we have one question that would be good to hear, Kristen.
Okay.
And that is, by what extent does lower Twin become anoxic, and how far down does epilinion go?
So let me pull up that, just a second, I'll screen share again. And I'm going to pull up that slide. Just a second. Can everybody see the slide?
Yes.
Except I'm locked. Just a second. I'm not the best at screen sharing with Zoom, so be patient with me. And then I've got okay, here we go. All right, so to what extent, could you repeat the question?
To what extent does lower Twin become anoxic, and how far down does epilinion go?
Okay, so in this particular, so the stratification can change, but what we saw in this particular date, and then we did another one maybe a week or two later, and it was very similar, So in this situation, the epilimnion was 5 meters deep from the surface, and then the anoxic layer was from the bottom clear up to 7. I mean, we're talking 0% oxygen. And then from 0 to about 50%, we were almost to the epilimnion.
So Kristen, can you show how we determine where the epilimnium goes with the temperature?
Yeah, so if you look at the temperature profile, it's kind of got this S-shaped curve. And the epilimnium ends at when we start to get this knee on this top, the upper, does everybody understand that this knee? So we've got similar temperature and then it starts to decrease. And when we get that knee, that's when we get the bottom of the epilimnion. And then the thermocline's a real quick decrease in temperature, and then we get kind of another knee. That's the best way to explain it. And the top of that knee is the hypolimnion, the top of the hypolimnion.
So about 15 feet on average, Kristen?
For what?
The epilimnion?
5, yeah.
Okay.
5 meters.
All right, I got a lot more questions I got some on climate change and some more on prevention. Do you want to continue to defer those till after the next talk?
Yes,
Yeah, that's Frank's talk.
All righty. I think that's got it for right now.
Okay. Well, welcome and thanks for sticking through. Come on. So my name is Frank Wilhelm, and I've been asked to discuss some of the potential management options for Twin Lakes and sort of consider where we go from here and how we move forward. So just to give you a background, I'm a limnologist, so that's the study of inland water. So anything that's wet but not in the ocean or not salty is considered limnology. We do have some very saline lakes inland. We do consider those. So any water that drains to the ocean is considered part of limnology. I've been at the University of Idaho since 2007, where I teach undergraduates, I teach graduate students. And then I have interests in lake management and surface water, particularly with response to, in relationship to cyanobacteria. And then part of my past includes a stint as the president of the North American Lake Management Society, which is a gathering of society of professionals that's interested in managing lakes and water bodies across North America. It's actually worldwide. So I do have a little bit of experience in that arena. So I'll give you a quick outline. So I'm going to give you the summary first, and then you can go eat ice cream. And then look a little bit at the background studies that have occurred, and then just stress the importance of controlling that phosphate, and then look at some options. So the summary is, we have these lakes. There are these wonderful resources. All of you know about these. This is why you're here today. If we degrade those resources, then we lose our resource dependent activities or any of those amenities that we have along with that. And that's what we're here to try and prevent. It's very similar, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you can keep the phosphate out of the lakes, it may seem expensive to do some of these stream restorations or erosion control structures at this point, but let me tell you, it's a lot cheaper to do that than to try and fix a lake at the other end when you have the phosphate in it. So if you think of the lake as the bathtub, the drain of the landscape, everything that happens in the landscape ends up in the lake. So if you can prevent that from getting to the lake in the first place, that's the best thing that we can do. And then we can manage P, we can intercept it. As I said, before it gets to the lake, we can try and remove it from the water that gets to the lake itself. And then very sad state of affairs, we can try and immobilize it, but then you have to realize we're sticking band-aids only onto trying to fix something that's already happened. And that also happens to be very, very expensive. Okay, so just to recap and see where we've come from. Back in '87, Falter and Hollock presented their findings from their study from '85 and '86. and that was called Limnological Study and Management Plan for Upper and Lower Twin Lakes in Kootenai County, Idaho. That's available, freely available on the web. And that was a really comprehensive examination of both lakes, looking at the inflows, all of the contributions from the landscape, the internal loading, wet and dry deposition, and then all of the tributaries. And then the Idaho Clean Lakes Coordinating Council in '91 came out with the Twin Lake Management Plan that is also available on the web. And that was primarily based on Falter and Hallock's study in '85 and '86. And then in 2000, IDEQ came out with a TMDL for Twin Lakes. That's a total maximum daily load, because Fish Creek came out in 2008, Twin Lakes in 2000, and they were both for total phosphorus as an impairment to long-term water quality in those water bodies. So what I thought I'd do is have a look at what the issues were that were identified 30 years ago. That's from, well, 35 years ago if you go 85. And that was high phosphorus and sediment, so resulting from human activities in the watershed. And the study came about in response to complaints and concerns from citizens at Twin Lakes and surrounding areas that the lake was infilling with sediment and that there was increased algal productivity from potentially from nutrients. And then in that management plan, it states that 1 pound of P, so 1 pound of phosphorus, contributes to about 500 pounds of algae. And this stresses the importance that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in the Twin Lakes. So we have a ratio of carbon and nitrogen of phosphorus, and phosphorus happens to be present in the lowest quantity. So if you add just a little bit of phosphate, you can greatly increase the productivity of the system. And hence, that's the reason for the focus on the phosphate and then also on the sediment, because as Kristen mentioned, the phosphate is really reactive. It doesn't want to be in the water column by itself, and it's really sticky, so it sticks to sediment, and it's very easily transported with sediment when we mobilize that across the landscape. So here's a breakdown from back then. This is probably the best breakdown we have to date in terms of what the different contributions are, both to the upper and the lower lake. And Falter had these separated by 85 and 86, and I've just combined them both together just to summarize it here. But if you look at the tributaries, they bring in about 60 to 80% of the phosphate. Precipitation brings in about 10 to 12%. The wastewater is, they calculated this based on septic systems and number of systems that were not okay at the time. They also indicated in the management plan that there had been some upgrade of septic systems. These are private septic systems. However, those were not brought up to standards in place at the time. And then there was some grazing in the upper watershed to the west of Upper Twin Lake, that brought in 5%. And then there's this internal loading that Kristen just finished talking about. It's not a concern in the upper lake because it's so shallow and it's well oxygenated throughout the entire water column. But then if you look at the bottom of the lower lake, sorry, not the bottom, the lower lake, it contributes, internal loading contributes about 20% of the annual load to the entire lake. And then the motorboats was an examination of how much, because the exhaust is routed through the propeller in most motorboats, the question was, how much does exhaust contribute to phosphate? And the answer to that was it's negligible at that point. And then with our increased EPA standards and regulations on motorboats, most engines going to 4 strokes and being much cleaner, that concern is no longer with us. So one of the things that they did in the management plan study, also in Falter studies, they looked here at the, so this is a fairly complicated graph, but here's the TP loading. So the total phosphorus in grams of phosphate per square meter per year. So how much phosphate comes in per square meter of lake area per year. And then on the bottom axis, also on a logarithmic scale, is the average depth divided by the lake turnover time. And this is an index of how well lakes are behaving. So if you see what I've circled in blue here, that's oligotrophic. So these are the pure, pristine, clear waters, very little productivity. And this permissible loading line right here, the lower line, is what separates this oligotrophic zone from the eutrophic zone. And once you cross this, you're in that in between, that mesotrophic status. And then once you cross across this excessive loading, then you end up in this eutrophic zone. So this is where Fernan is firmly planted in this area. And at the time of Falter's study, with the loading that was occurring, upper and lower twin were right in between, which is why it was classified as a mesotrophic, oligotrophic, mesotrophic lake system. So low to intermediate productivity. Okay, so then they made some recommendations, as did the management plan that was formulated. And one of those was generate soil erosion maps, some plans across the county, and then look at road management programs. And these were primarily directed at some of the forced practices that are occurring on the Inland Empire Paper Company land. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a minute, because some of those roads that are put in to extract logs are known to contribute a lot of runoff and sediment to down gradient systems. There is also the recommendation to upgrade septic systems. There is the recognition that private landowners will probably not welcome inspections on their land, and so that was mentioned in the report. However, collectively, we need to think about this in terms of what we're doing to the lake systems. There was a consideration, one of the options that's available, and this is used in some other lakes, is chemical treatment. And you can add this aluminum sulfate, or alum as it's commonly called, and it contains calcium and other aluminum, and it's a very strong binder of phosphate. So you spread it in a slurry in the lake, it causes the lake to go white for a couple of days, and then that flock will settle, and as it does, it strips all of the phosphate out of the water column. It also provides then a cap, but that cap is only effective until more sediment comes in and it buries it. So currently, in the last 35 years, then we've had a change. We've also now got Phoslock, which is lanthanum clay. It's a earth mineral. It's also very good at binding phosphate. Both of these are very, very expensive propositions, and then they were discounted as a management option just because they figured that it would only last 4 years. And at the time, I think it was $800,000 to treat the lakes. That was 35 years ago. So it was prohibitively expensive then, and it would be even more so at this point. Plus, you're adding a chemical to the water column and the lake, and a lot of individuals are opposed to adding any sort of chemicals. There's the residential stormwater runoff. So this was indicated, we need a good education program in terms of alerting homeowners to what they can do and how they can minimize runoff and stormwater runoff from their properties. It was also recommended not to construct any more dry wells in the city. So dry wells are these sumps. So you dig a hole, excavate a hole, put a grate over it, and then when it rains, water can naturally back infiltrate through that. And they've found that individuals are using those to dispose of all kinds of things, because once it's down there, it's gone from sight. The other options that were considered back then or recommended is looking at setback distances. So these are for buildings. Currently, you have a 25-foot setback distance in Bonner County. And then look at natural buffer zones where you have maintained the natural vegetation instead of lawn right down to the water's edge. And that will help the water sheet flow that comes from overland flow to infiltrate, and for the vegetation to take that up. And there's some very good USGS studies that show that a natural shoreline with natural vegetation has very good uptake potential for phosphate and to intercept rainwater that's coming over the landscape. Okay, then there's this shallow water dredging, and the idea here was to dredge below 3.3 feet because that's where the accumulation of the fine material had occurred. And this was recommended for Lower Twin Lake, and removal of 1 to 3 feet of that slurry that had accumulated, but across the entire lake. This was also a very expensive proposition just because of the amount of material removed and that needed to be stored. The other options, recommendations were to reduce livestock grazing along the creek. This is in the Upper Twin Lake along Fish Creek, and then to put fencing in on that, on those properties to prevent the cows from and cattle from coming into the soft areas and then disturbing the stream banks and causing erosion in that manner. The other two were looking at the internal cycling, so that was also addressed or recognized back then. One of the propositions was to harvest the top 3.5 feet of macrophytes off the top of so the macrophytes grow from the bottom up, and the idea was to have a harvester come along, clip off the top 3.5 feet. The calculations back in the day were if you did that, you would remove about 331 pounds of phosphate from the water column. The recognition is that those macrophytes, so the big plants that grow on the bottom of the upper lake, they represent about 87% of the phosphate at the time of all of the entire nutrient budget. So the idea was remove the macrophytes, get them out of the watershed, and that would immediately reduce the phosphate that goes down to the lower basin, and you could see about a 10 to 20% reduction in algae. Now the run of harvester is fairly expensive, and they did some back of the envelope calculations back then. I don't know what the current costs would be. You would need to have a look at those. And then there was the recommendation to put a hyperlimnetic aerator into the lower basin to supply about 42 cubic feet per minute for the 117-day duration that the bottom of the lake is separated from the atmosphere, and to pump air or oxygen into the bottom. And they figured at 42 cubic feet per minute, you could maintain 40 to 70% saturation. And then that would remove all of the internal loading that we currently see that Kristen just talked about in terms of that phosphate coming up from the bottom of the sediment into the water column. Okay, so that was 35 years ago. 30 years ago, 1990 is when the 91 is when the management plan was articulated and published. What's missing in all of this is a comprehensive collection of what's been done to date. So there are drips and drabs reports here and there, but they're scattered all over the place. And we don't understand how effective those were, those installations. So for example, there's been fencing that's occurred. Inland Empire's done a very good job on decommissioning roads and returning those to natural state. We don't understand what the benefit is to the lake. And while the citizen volunteer monitoring program has been ongoing, and that's a commendable effort from the folks at Twin Lakes, and I hope they continue that, we do need to point out that those data are not sufficient to construct these nutrient budgets that we need to determine whether or not a management action has been effective or there's been less sediment that's been coming in. So these are the inputs and outputs that we're missing out of that. Okay, so my number one recommendation is before moving forward and before doing anything major, it would be really good to understand the current state of both of the lakes. The Falter and Halleck study was 35 years ago. There's been a lot of changes, and before we move into any major management, it would be really good to understand what the current state of the system is. The first rule of lake management, very similar to a doctor, is do no harm. And for you to be effective at that, you need to understand what the conditions are. And then you need to understand what the consequences of the actions are. So everything in the lake, like everywhere else, is connected. It would be ludicrous to do something and expect solely that result without looking at potential knock-on effects downstream or in other parts of the system. So before you do anything, if you're only considering one management aspect in isolation, that's a pretty not robust way of moving forward. Okay, so here's the list again that I just went through, and then this time I've titled it What's Been Done. So the soil erosion maps have been created, the streams and the tributaries have been walked, and there's very good erosion maps for those. The road management program is in place from Inland Empire. They've done a really good job there. The septic systems, the city or the village of Twin Lakes, the recent additions are on a sewer system. Most of the lakefront properties are still on septic systems, and the age and status of those is unknown. Could be relatively leaky. So monitoring those or having a check on those would be fairly imperative, because in 75 and then more recently, Panhandle Health indicated that there were significant fecal coliform bacteria. So those are indicative of human waste and waste products ending up in the lake. They did find those. Okay, the stormwater runoff, I don't understand or don't know at this point how much education has occurred as a result of the management plan. And so the jury's out on that. If anybody on the audience has any indication of what sort of bulletins go out, or what sort of residential training has occurred, that would be good to know. I've flagged the shallow water dredging. I understand there's a proposal currently in place to dredge the shallows, or the narrows, I guess it's called, between the upper and the lower lake. The shallow water dredging that was proposed was for the entire lake, lower Twin Lakes. So it's a different proposition than what's currently on the table. The reduced livestock grazing along the creek has occurred, and the fencing has occurred. So that's good progress there. I understand there's still a little bit of stream bank stability and reconstruction to be done on Fish Creek to bring that. I think there's indication of 8,000 feet that was needed through the lower floodplain area. The last two internal cycling, P cycling, and then the hyperlimnetic aeration have not been touched. And I just want to indicate that the hyperlimnetic aeration is something that I'm involved with both in research and management in a different reservoir over in Oregon. And it's an Army Corps of Engineers reservoir, and they have elected to move forward with the aeration. And so I can talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so here's the Twin Lakes. These are the bathymetric maps, or the upside down topographic maps. So it gives us an idea of where the contours are. The contours here are in meters, so that each meter is 3.2808 feet. And the harvest of the top 3.5 feet of macrophytes was proposed for the entire top lake. In my opinion, that is still something that should be on the table, should be considered, because if you can, those macrophytes take up the nutrients from the sediment, they convert that into biomass, very similar to when your grass grows. You come along, you clip it, and you remove those clippings, and when you do so, you remove the phosphorus that's contained in that biomass. So that, I think, is a valuable strategy that should be considered by the Twin Lakes Improvement Association. And then the other part that was proposed was aeration in the two deep basins, one aerator in each of the basins to deliver those 42 cubic feet per minute. And again, that is a very benign management strategy. It's used all over the US, all over the world, actually. And the technology is developed quite sufficient at this point that people can install these things to great success. And each year at the Lake Management Conference, so the professional society I'm a member of, has these annual meetings, and we regularly have a session on oxygenation, and there's some very successful systems that have recovered lakes in long term. And there's different ways to aerate lakes. So the water fountain is probably one of the easiest ones, or a bubbler, but then there's other forms of getting air into the bottom that are fairly nifty. And over in Oregon, the other reservoir I'm working on, they're looking at bringing the water up, aerating it at the surface, and then diving it right back down, because the temperature gradient is so strong that the water will dive back down. The cold water will dive back down. So it's really interesting, and it probably wouldn't be all that prohibitive in terms of expenses. There's also, I can hear people cringing already, even though I can't see you or hear you. But there's this chance to manage water levels. And one, it promotes the flow through the lake. It decreases the turnover time, and turnover time means how long the water stays in the lake. So if you have good flow through the lake, it shortens that turnover time. So in the upper lake, it takes about 1/3 of a year for all of the water to be replenished. And then down in the bottom lake, it's about 0.59 years, so just about shy of 2/3 of a year to replace all of the lake water in the bottom, in the lower lake, sorry. And then it also, if you promote the flow, it avoids this non-natural inundation of shorelines. And we have some experience with that at Fernan Lake, where there's a wetland at the east end of the lake, and when the village puts their dam in, their 2-foot dam, to keep the water level up, to keep people happy, then there is an inundation of that wetland, and it's not a naturally inundated area. And this is what this looks like. So this is at the very east end of Fernan Lake. I-90 is down at the west end of the lake. And we've done some monitoring here. Here's the flow through that wetland from the stream that comes in. We've monitored sites here. We've monitored them all over the wetland. And the wetland is so organically rich that it's totally anoxic. So there's no oxygen present. So at very shallow depth of about 3 feet, we get the exact same process happening that Kristen explained what was happening in the bottom of Lower Twin Lake. And we get this phosphate loading into the water column, and then this flow and the wind exchange just whips it out into the lake itself. So lake level management by just a couple feet can have a large impact on what happens in a water body. And I would encourage the individuals that are responsible for managing water levels to give that some serious thought. Okay, and then of course with managing water levels, you need to consider the water rights that go along with that. So it would probably take some sorting out, but I'm sure there's some, if that was a worthwhile, or there's some desire to pursue that people could come to some sort of agreement on that. Okay, so just to summarize here, 1, do no harm. So that, I guess that's my biggest recommendation, whatever folks decide to do moving forward, is just be really cognizant of what potential knock-on effects there are from potential management actions. And then as a scientist, my biggest hang up is what's the current status, and then how do past management activities stack up. The TMDL that IDEQ put together has a target for 22 micrograms of phosphorus, total phosphorus in the upper lake, and then half of that, 11 micrograms per liter in the lower lake. Those targets are not being met at this point in time. And so the question is why and why not, and what practices have worked and what hasn't worked. And then pick the ones that have worked and amplify those. And then my number 2, what's the current status, is really required to evaluate what the best management options are moving forward. And so, 35 years is a long time. A lot of changes have occurred on the landscape. There were 563 homes that were identified around the lakeshore back then. I'm sure that has increased some. At this point, I understand there's a proposal for 50-unit housing complex going on the west side of the lake. So these are these cumulative impacts that Kristen talked about. And then I would suggest that we're all in this together. And I know it's getting a little old, that saying, but involve the property owners in the decision. Look at education, and then the stormwater management is probably a pretty low-hanging fruit, or working with landowners to create buffer strips on their shoreline and keep that natural area present, the vegetation to slow that overland flow and slow the intrusion to the lake itself. And then with that, I'm happy to take some questions, or if Craig wants to moderate, we're happy to take questions at this point in time. These are all pictures from Fernan Lake, and I understood from some of the comments that you don't want Twin Lakes to get to this state, and I would encourage you to do everything in your power not to get to this point. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share, and then we'll kick it over to Craig, and Kristen's on and Bob's on. So happy to answer any questions and go from there.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, Frank, for that great talk. You covered a lot of them, but there's a backlog, so I'm going to kind of go through them.
For sure.
The first one's probably for Kristen and Bob. This is from Cheryl. And that's, can we get someone to come to Twin Lakes Loop Road meeting to help share this information more broadly? And are you going to get mailings sent to owners on how to prevent the influences on harmful algae blooms? So Bob, Kristen?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and we'd be glad to come and present information to groups if they need it. We'll also have this presentation available. I think we've recorded it, so we can share that with them if they'd like to see it as well. So yeah, there's no reason we can't come to those. We just need a request and got to have the manpower to do it.
Okay. Here's a good question that's left. It's a good introductory. Is what can cabin owners and lake users do to reduce the HAB potential in the kind of order of significance?
You know, Craig, one thing that comes to my mind is lake assist. We've done that on Pondray Lake and Coeur d'Alene Lake. It'd be something that would be interesting for folks to look at, but it's essentially a manual that's given to all the owners around the area on what things you can do to make a difference on a cabin by cabin basis to reducing, you know, excess phosphorus from your system.
And I think I'd like to add to that, when we talk about shoreline buffers, we don't necessarily mean that you have to have this long, leggy, natural vegetation on your, I mean, that would be the cheapest thing if you bought property and the vegetation were there just to leave it. But there can be some real nice looking landscaping options that give you access to the lake and also can filter out the phosphorus and and sediment. And then of course, one of the big ones is if you've got a lawn to use when you're buying your fertilizer, make sure there's no phosphorus in it. You can buy, I mean, Bob and I we went to Lowe's one summer and said, what do you recommend for lawns? And they took us to this highest percent phosphorus fertilizer. And right there in that group of fertilizers was also a bag of fertilizer that had 0 phosphorus. So shoreline owners can certainly do their part right away with their landscaping.
Okay.
Kristen,
Yeah,
also,
go ahead, Bob.
also on that one, you can get your soil tested as well to find out if it needs phosphorus or not. And sometimes you can do that as a community and put together kind of an education campaign at the same time as getting people to dig up soil samples and have those processed as a group.
So back in the last part of the first decade of the 2000s, 2006, 2007, when Washington State, their Washington Lakes Protection Association was pretty aggressive in banning phosphate containing fertilizers from the state of Washington. And they were successful in doing that. So the only place you can have phosphate in your fertilizers if you're establishing a new lawn. And that was based on a fairly extensive survey from the Extension Service. So we asked, I was part of that organization, still am. We asked all of the extension services to provide the soil tests across the state of Washington. And it was surprising, there was 1 or 2 areas where the soils were identified as phosphorus deficient. In every other part of the state, there was no need to add phosphate to grow grass. And I would suspect that Idaho is not far behind those sort of conditions. And so there's really no reason to have phosphate in any of the fertilizer that you apply.
Wow. All righty. Here's one that's right up Frank's alley, and that is about wake zones. Would it be helpful to have no wake zones? How would we enforce it? Not many people abide by them. What would be the helpful of doing no wake zones?
Yeah, so we're just ramping up a research program right now, both on Payette and Coeur d'Alene Lakes, to specifically look at the effect of especially these big wake boats, the wet technology, so the wave enhancement technology that allows you to surf on inland lakes, the 5-foot wakes that are created. And so the jury's out on that, but the idea is to come back with a plan to look at no wake zones and how to set them. The enforcement obviously is a big issue, and then some of the initial work that we've done indicates that it's what we call transient. So people that don't live around the lake that end up coming in, or their friends come in, they do the wake boating and then they take off at the end of the day. So the damage is done, then they pull out and go home. And in Payette Lake, Big Payette Lake, that came to a head last year, and they've actually decided to fund a graduate student out of my lab and to look at that extensively. And she just started her work right now, and we're just selecting sites, and then we're going to go after that from a scientific perspective. And the whole idea is to look at how much phosphorus is liberated when those wakes hit the shore, and how much sediment is liberated and resuspended in the water column. So
Excellent.
I don't wake boat. I understand that people enjoy it, but Bonner County has a really good slogan, and it says ride the core, save the shore. And that's probably the best thing, but I understand it's hard to enforce, and sometimes it's easier just to slip out front of the house or the boat dock and yahoo around in front of there and then have the enjoyment there. And many people are not conscious of the damage that the wakes do when they hit the shoreline. But enforcement is an issue, and the Kootenai County Sheriff Department, who's in charge of enforcing the no wake zone in Kootenai County, has indicated that it's a very difficult aspect in law to enforce.
Excellent. Another one that's kind of an interesting question, and this comes from Chris, is that we have a water run for dogs at Twin Lakes Village to keep them in one place with the owner not running on the waterfront. Is that not good? Is that not beneficial? And what would you recommend about the water dog run?
So is the dog run right next to the lake? Is that the question?
I'm not entirely sure.
On the shoreline?
Maybe if we could recognize Chris to ask that and share that discussion.
Unmute yourself, Chris.
Unmute, Chris.
Lower left-hand
Chris
lower
Bowles,
left-hand corner.
Down at the bottom.
There you go.
You'll
There you
see. There you go.
Yeah. As you go down to our waterfront, we have the two docks. Towards the left, in the water, we have a little dog run, so they can throw a ball and go get it and swim back. And we have them right there so that they're not going out into the swim area. They're not traipsing on the waterfront, the quote beach itself. And we did it because we were trying to keep the dogs from being all over the beach. And
Yeah.
it's a small area. You may have seen it, Kristen. I'm
So
happy to
Chris, I think I've been to that place and I've taken my dog there. Twin Lakes Village does a great job with they have the bags for pet waste to pick up your pet waste. And as long as people are picking up after their pet, it's okay. It's when they're not picking up and then it rains, then you've got a problem. I don't know if you've got that pet waste station down there as well, but if they're convenient, people use them. I mean, they're all over Coeur d'Alene Lake, Shore Drive, and if they're convenient and they're stocked with the bags, people use them.
Yeah, and we have them all over, and I'll make sure we get one down there.
Yeah, those are great.
Okay.
I do want to weigh in though, if you know, that's why we're providing the advisories. So just take note when we have an advisory and you're looking for, you know, those kind of green, yellow blooms or something that's unusual out there, that would be a time that I wouldn't let my dog exercise in the water.
Right, right. And Bob, somebody asked our feedback on those signs, and while a press release and an advisory is really thorough and good for us to read, the people who are the users don't read them. You really need to have that sign that Kristen provided us with that said alert and a couple of colors and large font in order for a user group to take heed.
So do you have suggestions for the one that we posted last year? We can always modify if I know that's your area of expertise. meaning, you know, marketing to the public.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, thank you. A little
If
bit
there's
about-
suggestions for our sign, we'll certainly take them. We're always modifying it.
I'll get back to you on that, Kristen.
Okay, and we do have it in Spanish as well.
Excellent. I've got kind of two more specifics before the generals. And one is, what is this? This is from Bill. What is a setback, if any, in Kootenai County?
25 feet for buildings.
Gotcha. All right. And then
Frank,
how much
you said Bonner County when you did your introduction, so that might have been a little confusing.
Oh yeah, sorry, Kootenai County. So they were at 0 when you had your previous to last election. Those commissioners made it 0, and then you cleaned house, and now it's back to 25 feet. And if you look at adjoining counties, if you look at Lincoln County over in Montana, it's 150 feet. And then over in Pend Oreille County in Washington, I think it's 50 feet as well. So there's quite a bit of variability. In Idaho, we have some of the lowest. And then if you go to Wisconsin, you're looking at 350 feet with no allowance for disturbance except one path down to the lake. And you're allowed to cut a view shed with consultation with the folks from the DNR. But that's it. That's the only disturbance you're allowed to make to the land at 10,000 lake shorelines.
Wow. So, hey, Frank, as a follow-up, what kind of setback would be needed to be protective of the lakes?
So it depends on the topography. So the steeper, obviously, the more setback you should have. There's, you know, as Kristen mentioned, if you get the shrubby layer, nice dense layer, I have some pictures of buffer strips with naturally planted foliage and flowers. It's a wildflower mix, and it's scrubby, but it looks really beautiful because there's something blooming all the time over the course of the summer, and really effective at slowing water down from overland flow reaching the lake itself. So, you know, I cringe when I see a seawall with grass hanging over the top of it. That just makes my hair stand up on end.
All right. Kind of one more specific is, this is from Cheryl. How much is Inland Empire monitored for its runoff?
Yeah, so there's $1 million question. I don't think they are. They're employing best management practices on recovering their roads, but then there's no gauging station, and there's no. There might be a gauging station on Fish Creek, but there's definitely no monitoring station. And this is why I'm saying it's probably a good idea to have a look at what the inflows are and do the annual study and look at what's coming in.
If there's somebody from Inland Empire on the call, if you want to, we'll give you a couple seconds if you want to respond to that.
If they'll identify themselves and step
Okay,
up.
that's
All right.
fine.
Well,
I
that's
guess-
definitely a data gap. I mean, that's something
Yeah,
we don't know.
Right. I guess the rest of them we got, and this would be a good time just to go through the deferred questions, is what can people do to, again, help fix the lake?
So my knee-jerk reaction as a homeowner is make sure your septic system, if you're on a septic system, that is functioning properly. Those are not, if it's not functioning properly, it's not a cheap proposition. If you're a responsible lake owner, you're worried about your contribution to the lake, then you'll look to get it fixed. You can do dye tracing. You can pick it up in the shoreline. It's not that hard to do, but you have to be willing to do it. Stormwater management, buffer strips along the shoreline, setbacks, and then just being responsible boater user of the lake. Those, I guess, would be, as an individual, from an individual perspective, would be my top ones, I guess. Bob, Kristen?
yeah, and then
Chime in.
just from a overall management perspective, just if you're choosing to do bigger management propositions that might have might have bigger impacts to the lake, we're really saying that we don't have enough information to, I mean, make sure you got your ducks in a row and you know for sure those actions are a benefit to the lake and not a detriment.
And I would add into that we clearly see a gap in 35 years of having a good assessment and understanding of what's going on with the lake. And, you know, we all need to work together to figure out how to make that happen. It doesn't fit within DEQ's purview just to do that type of thing. And we probably don't have the staff to pull that off. We need to look at academia and other folks to help us with a study like that, but that comes with a cost, and we need to make sure we do that.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, Frank and his graduate students have done a lot of work on Fernan Lake. It was quite an evolutionary process of discovering the real issues with that lake, and it just was finding graduate students and collecting the information and the data we could dial down to what the problem really is with that lake, or the problems.
Okay. I got one last that's been already sent in through chat. So before I give it, if beyond this one, if any more, put them in the chat, do the raise hand, and we'll certainly get you in here. This is from Bill, and it's, I'll probably throw it to Frank first. And that is, looking ahead, what is the influence of climate change on the problem? How's that going to impact things?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I saw that one pop up before. So the predictions for the inland Northwest and northern Idaho are for the snowpack to decrease, and for the rain events to snow on rain event to become more frequent, up to higher elevations over time there. So those are from John Abatsoglu, who's done the climate modeling downscaling for Idaho. He was our climatologist here over in geography that was working on that. And he's had several graduate students. So with a lower snowpack then comes less flushing. And it could be, there's also an increased frequency of high cloudburst activity type of things. So these infrequent but relatively heavy thunderstorms, these what we could term gully washers, are going to bring a lot of material in to low flow situation. So my prediction would be that it's probably going to you're looking at situations that are going to exacerbate in the future. Plus, if you warm a lake by 2 or 3 degrees, it doesn't seem that much because you take a sweater off, right? But in the lake itself, 2 or 3 degrees is a huge deal. And cyanobacteria love warm water. And they love stagnant water. So the less flow and the hotter it gets, the better they love it.
Righty. Can we get Paul Buckland unmuted, Christine, Bob? Okay. He had a.
Okay, there he goes.
There you go, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
10-4.
Yeah.
Okay, so to answer a question about monitoring, there's just like Frank said, there's monitoring of BMPs, forest practices, and road building and road maintenance activities all throughout the year, every year. But and they do look at, they do focus on sedimentation from roads specifically. But as far as actual measurement of sediment loading, I'm not aware of any ongoing monitoring in the watershed.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all we've got, the questions so far. So if I missed anything, please let me know. And it's open discussion, I guess.
So for this section, if you can raise your hand, Christine will unmute you, and we can have questions brought up at this point. So you go to your participants panel, and on the right side of it, it says raise hand. Well, gosh, we must have been pretty thorough. I don't see any additional questions coming up. Oh, Chris is
Chris's hand.
That's another way to do it, like that.
Yeah.
I couldn't find it down here. Two things. Number one is I think that this was a great narrowcast and you were terrific, and with all of your information and all of your insinuations, I thought it was really well worth my time. But I think we need to broadcast. And so the question back to you is, what are the next plans, not just to narrowcast this, but to broadcast? Is there a very simple one-pager that can be distributed through TLIA or can be distributed around the lake that is lake specific, that, you know, what the problem is and what can we do, and, you know, an action document. And because a lot of people love the lake enough that they'll do it without knowing all of the science. You know, hopefully they believe it.
Chris, I appreciate the question. You know, the 1990, what was that? Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, Frank. The 91
Twin Lakes Management Plan. Yep.
The management plan was kind of superseded by our TMDL program. And so back in that time, we would have a group that supports a community like yours around a lake. Now we're more set into writing prescriptions for how much load a lake can take. And we're not dealing with things holistically as much. But Krista and I will talk about it, and we'll see what we can fit into our schedule and come up with something that at least we can help with. You know, at least we could put together the poignant points of this presentation together for you to share with your community.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. If you were to rank by concern beyond Fernand Lake, what concern would you rank the conditions at Twin Lakes compared to other North Idaho lakes? Are we right behind Fernand Lake as far as concerns? Are we down quite a ways? My family and I have had a cabin on Lower Twin Lakes for about 50 years.
Yeah, again, I did that original survey where I did the whole shoreline. And what really struck me is I've never seen an Idaho lake with as much recreational pressure as Twin Lakes. You've got every dock, or every other dock that day was using the lake, swimming in it, kids playing in it, animals in it. It was really higher than anything. So it's really hard to compare that when I'm just looking at water chemistry alone to Fernand Lake or even Hayden Lake. It would be a high concern, and I think that you know, Kristen's kind of given us the yellow light, is we're on the border of having a problem here. And if we can prevent that earlier, we've really saved ourselves a lot, because I would hate to be in Fernand Lake situation here with the recreational pressure that y'all are seeing on Twin Lakes.
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to add to that, and I guess I'll stick my neck out a little bit, that there's a proposed dredging project between the two lakes, and we just would hope that enough information would be collected to really prove that that's an improvement to water quality and not a detriment. I think when you start doing some big projects like that and without collecting data to do it properly, or that it's going to benefit the lake, we might be moving into more of a red light situation. So we're not against that project. We just want it to be done smartly.
Which it's not being done now, I'm assuming. Sticking your neck out.
No, that's not the case. It's going through its permitting process for the.
It's been permitted.
Well, but that's not the question.
And it is precedent setting to do that. And then we talk about cumulative impacts, then other dredging projects, you know, and we start stacking those on top of each other. What's the cumulative impacts of having those projects done?
So I'll just quickly chime in on that too. So Bill, I'm going to throw it back at you. What is your experience? If your family's had a cabin on the lower lake for 50 years, what have you seen over that time period?
Just in the last couple of years, what I thought was just pollen turns out to have been cyanobacteria. I've seen that on the lake just the last couple of years. Haven't been out. Haven't been out this year. Wasn't out only one time last year. But I remember a couple of years ago, I would say 2018, saw a lot of it as I'm taking the boat across Twin Lakes to get to our cabin on the west side. Yeah, I'm pretty concerned both with that and also the eutrophication of the lake. Big concerns for me.
Sure.
I paid money for the dredging that has been done already, but I now have some concern about. I'm not sure what dredging is still being proposed, and not sure that even if it's been for a county that only has a 25-foot setback, for some dredging project to get approved doesn't give me a lot of that doesn't assure me that dredging project is going to be the best for the lake long term.
Hey, we have a hand raised from Deborah Andrews. Can we get her unmuted?
Andrews, hold on. She on the other page. There we go. Sorry. She's on a phone. She has to unmute herself.
Oh, all right. Deborah, if you can type your question in chat or unmute your phone.
Oh, there she is.
So my name is Deborah Andrews, and I'm the president of Twin Lakes Improvement Association. So a couple of things that I'd like to bring to the attention of the group. So first and foremost, a number of the comments that are being made here, like can Bob come to a meeting? Bob is scheduled currently to come to Twin Lakes Improvement Association's annual meeting and to discuss the topic here today. Secondly, I think it's important for Dr. Wilhelm, who's talking about the Faulkner study. We're well aware of that. We did the 319 grant with DEQ and did all of the project up on Fish Creek with the bank restorations. And so there's a lot of that that's in progress. And yes, there was a dredging project in 2015 that was also approved by your department and Department of Lands. And there has been comprehensive by state agency groups involvement in developing plans for Twin Lakes and doing those things. And I guess I would just say to the group that's on the line is I'd like to encourage everyone to become a party to Twin Lakes Improvement Association. The do's and don'ts for the lake, which is Lake Assist, is the name of the program that Bob suggested, has been on numerous occasions put out in newsletters and out at our annual meeting. So again, I think this group is quite active and is a good partner with the state agencies, and would just encourage people to be a part of the group and be a party to moving the solutions forward and not impeding them.
Great.
Thank you, Deb.
Thanks, Deb. See you at the meeting.
Wow, well, I really appreciate everybody's attention. I know these Zoom meetings are hard, and it would have been a lot easier to do it in a face-to-face meeting. Kristen and I are obviously available, so if you can get through to any of our emails, we would be glad to take additional questions, or if you want to talk about anything offline, we can do that. I really appreciate everybody's attendance and want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bob, this is Doug Jane.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, and I had a number of questions. For some reason, I wasn't able to get them up through the chat line, so I probably got 6 to 8 different questions. So I will just write them up and send emails to basically all of you folks and see if somebody can help me.
Doug, we're willing to hang out now if you want to talk about them when you've got Frank available too. whichever works best for you.
Okay, well, yeah, I don't want to, other folks have other things to do, but yeah, I can go ahead and ask some of those. Right now, I was interested in, one was, why does the low dissolved oxygen water not mix upward along with the phosphorus during the lake turning process? I was wondering why the low dissolved oxygen is not, if the phosphorus via the decay of the vegetation is being released into the water down low and then moving upward up in the water column up towards the surface where it's available for algal growth. Why is that not then taking some of that low dissolved oxygen water with it during the lake turning process?
Well, as soon as you have that lake turning process, you're introducing oxygen into whether it's a lake turning with the cooling of atmospheric temperature, or whether there's agitation from boat wake or wind or wave action. You're introducing atmospheric oxygen into the water column, so it's mixed. So then your oxygen concentration changes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Frank,
there's no time of the year where that low dissolved oxygen, you're saying, I was just wondering, there's no way to get the oxygen in down low in the lake. Is that what you're saying?
Not when it's stratified like that. That's why you introduce the bubblers and the aeration. The oxygen can't go from the atmosphere down to those lower levels.
Okay. Then I was curious as to what the cost of aeration would be, if there's any case examples around here. I was talking with Jeremy Jenkins at the Liberty Lake Sewer District, and he mentioned that Newman Lake had something going on, some bay at Newman Lake, but it was costing them several $100,000 a year to operate.
Yep. So at Newman Lake, they have what's called the Spies Cone. And it's an expensive piece of equipment to start with, and then it's hungry on an annual basis. So what they're doing there is they're injecting pure oxygen. Liquid oxygen flows into a regulator, and then it's gasified, and they're injecting that into the bottom of the water. They're bringing water down from the inside of the cone. They're bringing water down. They're forcing water down and from the top, and then oxygen up from the bottom. So they get very efficient aeration, but they're using pure oxygen to do that. So they need to bring pure oxygen in, and I think they bring it in. I don't think they have a oxygenation plant at the lake itself. And so that's about one of the most expensive systems you can install.
Okay. I mean, how did they have to select that option when it's
well, there was an engineering study done, and it took a lot of money, and then that's what they ended up with in terms of this is your best option to do that. There are other systems. So you can go from pure oxygen injection with micro bubbles that dissolve, so all of the oxygen dissolves in the water before it gets up into the water column, to just putting a sinking rubber line into the lake and then putting an air compressor on shore and pumping air into the water itself. And you do have to be careful with those systems. And then there's things called layer aeration, where you bring the water up, you allow it to oxygenate at the surface, and then you have a downward tube. So you bring that cold water up, aerate it, and then you have a downward tube, and you bring it right back down into the bottom of the lake without letting it pool across the top. And that's what the Army Corps has opted to do over in Willow Creek Reservoir. And I'm going to be working that over the next 4 or 5 years on that project. We're moving into the implementation phase over there. So Willow Creek Reservoir, very similar to Fernand Lake, has severe anoxia in the bottom, and then has really very predictable cyanobacteria blooms, toxic cyanobacteria blooms. And so the idea there is to get oxygen into the bottom of that reservoir and prevent that internal loading of phosphate to occur. Okay. So there's a variety of different options. And that playbook, that oxygenation and aeration playbook has gotten quite large in the last little while. And then the North American Lake Management Association last year came out, and they had a special issue on just on oxygenation. So it's the Journal of Lake and Reservoir Management, and then they had a special issue on just oxygenation from projects around the U.S. of what was working, what wasn't working, and some of the success stories. And then they had some costs associated in there as well.
Okay. If we were to consider doing something like that for Lower Twin Lake, is that something you could assist us to put together you know, evaluation of the application of various aeration technologies?
I potentially could, yes.
Okay. How
So-
about the
So
application?
Doug, keep in mind that Frank is in the game of funding graduate students to do stuff like this.
Okay,
So he's, you know,
that might be a
that's the
project.
way to, that's kind of the way to do it is help University of Idaho with a grad student to do some of that feasibility and help get that started.
Okay, I assume some further study would be needed before you could determine exactly what would be the most optimal way to go at it. Yeah. Okay, how about the application of nanobubbles? I understand that those are interesting technology, fairly recent to dealing with low dissolved oxygen. That
Yeah, so the whole point of those is to make, so the whole point of aeration is that whatever you inject, you want the bubble as small as possible. So you have the biggest surface area to volume ratio, so that you get that diffusion as that bubble travels through the water column. Because most aerators are actually so inefficient that there's very little transfer of oxygen across the bubble water interface. And then when the water gets to the surface and it rolls across the surface, most aerators, that's where most of the exchange occurs, and the re-aeration occurs at the surface and not at the bubble interface. So with the nanobubbles, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get that surface area, the volume ratio, as high as possible so that they do promote that exchange while the bubble is traveling through the water column.
okay, so that might have some application for us.
Yep.
Okay. On septic systems, you mentioned dye tracing. Are there also like nitrogen isotope or detergent brightener tracing you can use also? Are there other means to do? I don't know if dyes may be the best or the easiest. I don't know.
So the optical brighteners are pretty ubiquitous in laundry detergent. That's what makes your whites white, right? And if your septic system is leaking, those can be detected fairly easily.
Okay.
Another one, surprisingly, that they're using is caffeine.
Oh, okay. All right. Have you heard of any, grants for like agencies like Panhandle Health to when you have a clearly demonstrated failed system, or is it pretty much up to the homeowner to have to cough up, or it's a kind of a delicate.
So I'm not familiar with that area, Bob.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm afraid I can't answer that either. You'd have to talk to them.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah, on the channel project, the proposed dredging project, we have a situation there, which I'm sure you're probably aware, where we have every time a boat passes through there with prop wash, kicks up that nutrient-laden sediment there, and then it drifts on down with the current into Lower Twin Lake, which I'm assuming doesn't help Lower Twin Lake. And I was curious as to we want to, I'm with the Twin Lakes Improvement Association, and I've been involved in putting together that proposal. And I was curious as to the effectiveness of turbidity curtains to be able to block the suspended solids and so on moving into Lower Twin Lake during the project. I assume we'd be doing the project late in the season if there are low water and low recreational activity, probably in late September or October. But I assume that there's a, proper application of turbidity curtains and then great care when you remove those all needs to be done to prevent well, obviously you would try to wait till you settled out, clarified the water before you removed it. But is that something where that the vendor of the turbidity curtains, I understand there's different curtains and they have different ratings. Some that highway departments have been, their certification, I guess, for these when you buy them. You want to get the proper curtain set up. But I was just wondering, are they pretty effective at doing the job in a case like the project we're proposing?
Yeah, Doug, we review all that stuff when we do our certification for that. And we hold the contractor to the best available technologies when they're doing that. And then any extra conditions that we may have on the use of a silk curtain. I don't have any, well, I guess I have a little bit of direct, but most of ours is with metals, going through silk curtains. We're not seeing too much of that. But if they're properly installed and properly decommissioned, that I think that's a really good strategy for keeping water or particles from going throughout the water system.
Okay. Yeah, that would be the intent, is to seal it off there at the bridge in the channelway before, and to try to capture basically all. I'm sure you can't get 100%, but capture all of that, spend its solids as much as possible while you're removing the nutrients and the sediment there.
Right.
I was curious. We wanted to do some. We were thinking of doing some sediment sampling to determine the amount of nutrients in that top couple of feet to get constantly churned with boat props going through there. Is that something that we could look to you folks for some advice on, just how many samples, where to sample or whatever? We wanted to do some of that ahead of time, establish some baseline there. And we're moving through the project that over time, it's been like mid-50s since they originally dredged that channelway there. And it's become filled into the point now where we're just constantly working that zone with a navigation channel there.
Sure. Kristen and I can provide you some instruction on that. We did take a sample or two in 2019. We can share those results with you too, where we measured the phosphorus in that sediment in the channel.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. I'll follow up with that then. Let's see if I have any other stuff. Safety problems. Okay, well, we are going to be having our meeting here on the 11th of July, and I think Debbie Andrews had mentioned having somebody come and give us I guess, kind of a executive summary overview of our discussion today. We'd be very much like to do that. So I guess we'll just follow up via email or some phone calls to kind of coordinate on that. And I'm not sure if, Frank might be a good person to come talk to us. We're greatly interested in developing some best management practices and a comprehensive list that we put out on our website, and that we can introduce and encourage lake users and the properties, folks involved in the association to follow up with, to help cut down nutrient loading to the lake. So that's all I've got for now. I appreciate your help.
I plan on being there at the July 11th meeting.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, thanks, Bob. All right, that's all I've got, and I appreciate your staying a little late here to help answer.
DEQ folks, I'm going to send you an invite to a follow-up meeting. Okay. And you, Frank. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
See y'all.